Hi, and welcome to the Dye family parlor. This room would have been the hearth of the family home. This was the space where the family would gather together, perhaps to have a cup of tea, to sit and read books, write letters, entertain guests, perhaps to play a game of chess or cards. The women of the family might use this space for their spinning or their sewing. This was a room that was designed with both private comforts as well as social rituals in mind. And particularly for a family such as the Dye family, who had an elite status in colonial America. This is a white family, a wealthy family, a family who owned a pretty impressive home at the time. The parlor in particular would have been the chief means for the family to showcase their wealth, their gentility, their good taste. So everything in this room, from its furniture to its tea set to its decorative items, were all designed to convey a sense of status and comfort and gentility. Now, when the Dye family home became Washington's headquarters, the spaces and uses of the home would be dramatically transformed, along with the family's habits, right? The family would now have to adjust their eating patterns, their sleeping patterns, their entertaining patterns to make space for Washington and his men. At the time of Washington's arrival in July of 1780, Tunis Dye, the owner of the house, and his sons were active in the Bergen County militia. They were probably away from the home for all or part of Washington's stay, depending upon what was happening with their troops. Living in the home at the time of Washington's arrival was Tunis's wife, Hester, Hester's daughter-in-law, Hannah, Hannah's 3 young children, and one of Hester's adult daughters, a woman who also went by the name of Hester or Esther. While the family was happy to support the war effort, think about how chaotic and disruptive this must have been for the Dye family and the women of the family in particular. Think about all of the activity, the bustle, the chaos that would have now be a part of their daily lives, with so much activity coming and going, with soldiers and messengers and officers and staff. The house must have just been loud and busy and chaotic all of the time, right? The hall just outside would have been a scene of constant activity. Washington and his men probably took some of their meals outside in the hall, as it provided a nice open space for dining and entertaining. With all of this activity going on, this room in particular, the family parlor, must have taken on even additional significance for the family as a place of quietude and a place of refuge, a way of sort of trying to reclaim some family space in the middle of all this activity. The family may have even started to take some of their meals in here. They may have added a day bed to the furnishings to provide additional sleeping arrangements given the crowded nature of the house at the time. All of this helps to remind us that the Revolutionary War did not just take place on the battlefield. Often the war came to family homes and impacted women directly. This is especially true in New Jersey, a place that was home to so much troop movement and military engagement throughout the war. Think about how many Washington slept here or military encampment signs we see across the state, and then consider how many family stories and individual lives were a part of those activities. Families who allowed their family homes to be transformed into military headquarters gave important space and service to the war effort. The use of family homes and women's support for the war effort represented a trend that began in the years before the American Revolution. Beginning in the 1760s, when the colonists began to protest British taxation and other policies, they engaged in a series of what they called non-importation agreements, the boycotting of key items such as tea, linens, and other household goods. As women were often the primary consumers of these items, their support for and their participation in the boycotts was absolutely critical and crucial to their success. It also helps to remind us of the important roles that women played in managing their family economies. For a home such as this, just think about how much work, labor and management went into keeping a home like this running smoothly. The amount of effort that went into meal production, tea service, clothing, linens, candles, fires. This all required a great deal of effort on the part of the women in the household. With the boycott movements, the everyday tasks that women did within their own homes began to take on new public, patriotic, political significance. Women's personal choices now became purposeful actions in support of the war effort. And we see colonial Americans making direct appeals to women. If you look at the broadsides, the newspapers, pamphlets of the era, you see numerous appeals directly to the daughters of liberty to do their part supporting the patriotic cause. There's a 1767 poem, for example, that calls upon women to love your country more than fine things, urging them to give up their love of ribbons and luxurious fabrics and tea in order to support the patriotic cause. Women were encouraged to participate in the creation and the wearing of homespun clothing instead, making good use of the spinning wheels that would have been a part of their family homes. It was an essential part of, home-based textile production, of creating linens and other cloths. But the fabrics that would be created in this way would not have been as luxurious and rich and lovely as the imported linens that would have come from England and other areas. And so when women were asked to wear homespun, it was a very direct way of signifying their patriotic loyalty. Some women even engaged in collective spinning bees to very publicly showcase their support of the war effort in this way. Another key way in which women showed their support of the patriotic war effort was through tea. Now, 18th century Americans loved their tea, right? Tea services, tea rituals were such an important part of family sociability and the entertaining of guests and visitors. Now, the Dye family has a tea set that's fabulous. It dates from after the war, from about the 1790s, and is adorned with an American eagle. At the time, this would have been, one of the most highly recognizable signs of patriotism and show of support for the young nation. The Dye family purchasing of this tea set signaled, their patriotism, their allegiance to the new nation. And it helps to remind us of how material and household goods could have these meanings imprinted upon them. One of my favorite artifacts from the 18th century is another teapot. This is a teapot that has the words "No Stamp Act" on one side and "America, Liberty Restored" on the other. It was a teapot that was created in the 1760s. It was actually made in England to be sold in America after the repeal of the Stamp Act and during, a lull in the boycott movements. Picture a woman in a space such as this, entertaining her guests and serving them tea in a teapot that reads "No Stamp Act." Without saying a word, this woman would be conveying something very strongly about her family's loyalties and allegiances. There's also a great story about tea that dates back from this time, involving a young girl by the name of Susan Boudinot. Susan was the daughter of Elias Boudinot, who served as a delegate to the Continental Congress for New Jersey. As the story goes, Susan went on a visit to the home of William Franklin, who was then the royal governor of New Jersey, with her father. They were probably brought to a parlor such as this. Young Susan was offered a cup of tea, which would have been the ritual of the day. She politely accepted, walked across the parlor, and proceeded to dump the contents of her teacup out of a nearby open window. Susan's story was passed down in a variety of books aimed at children well into the 20th century. It helps to remind us that how one behaved in social settings, whether it was a visit to a family parlor or a more formal dinner, could have strong political implications. This was especially true once the war began. During the war, patterns and rituals of sociability could serve multiple meanings and have diplomatic significance. At Washington's various encampments and headquarters, rituals of sociability played important functions. At some moments, it was just a way of easing the tensions of wartime, right? Providing a moment of respite to help boost morale and to kind of provide a sense of calm and pleasantry to sort of offset the often uncomfortable conditions of war. We know that Martha Washington spent nearly half of her time away from her own home at Mount Vernon in order to accompany Washington to his various winter encampments. Now, unfortunately, there's no evidence that Martha visited Dye Mansion, but the visits that she did make to locations where Washington was encamped were so significant, right? Her presence, the presence of other military officers' wives, helped to convey a sense of warm sociability that helped to kind of convey to people that this was a cause worth fighting for, right? Particularly if there were foreign dignitaries visiting or foreign allies with, for whom Washington was trying to solicit support. Having Martha Washington and other women present at dinners and dances held at the military headquarters helped to provide a sense of confidence in the war effort, a sense that this was an effort that the nation, including its women, believed strongly in. And the qualities that women were supposed to embody, right, through their sociability, their friendliness, their hospitality, their willingness to sacrifice the personal comforts of their own homes in order to support the war effort, signaled very important messages for the war effort as a whole. When we take a closer look at family homes as military headquarters or the activities of women during the American Revolution, we get a great reminder that the experiences of war did not just take place on the battlefields, but also on what we would call the home front. And it's so important that we create a more expansive look at the war in order that we can get a more complete look at the experiences for the multitude of Americans whose lives were directly affected by the wartime experiences. It also helps to remind us of why a historic home such as Dye Mansion is so important, because it's a wonderful reminder of the importance of studying different places and spaces and experiences, right? The war came to the Dye family home, right? The war came to people's backyards, to their towns, right? And individuals experienced war in very upfront, personal, visceral ways that went beyond just the military engagements. This adds another layer of our understanding of the impact of war on everyday people that is so essential. It also helps us to remind ourselves that what we often like to demarcate as very sort of strong boundaries between what is personal and what is political, what is private, what is public, those boundaries could be much more fluid than we often consider, and particularly in a time of war when, troops would occupy a family home, right? Kind of completely sort of disintegrating those boundaries. It also reminds us of how multivariate the experiences of wartime could be. The Dye family women had to experience the disruptive effects of having Washington and his officers move into their home and transform their space into a military headquarters, but their experiences were still very different than the women who, for example, served as camp followers for Washington and his troops. These were women who would cook meals for, do the laundry for, provide other domestic tasks for Washington and his troops. They accompanied the troops, often facing very uncomfortable living conditions. Their experiences are very important to study. There's also numerous examples of women who managed their family homes, their family farms, their family businesses while their husbands were away at war, engaging in key logistical and financial decision-making activities for their families. And then there are great stories of women who directly engaged in fundraising and other activities in support of the war. We have the wonderful example of the Ladies of Trenton, which was an organization of New Jersey women across the state who engaged in a fundraising campaign for Washington's troops. The Dye family women were involved in these efforts. So as you can see, there's still lots of wonderful stories to tell. So we hope that you'll stay tuned for future programming.